the kind of thing that is going to lead to a really powerful and bitter critique on the part of the clerics. So they don't like one another at this point in time. Yeah.
So one of the things which appears in the scholarship a fair amount is that there is this distinctive, Islam is sympathetic and even supports slavery, right? That there's a kind of that slavery and Islam somehow go together.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could comment on that, because this is a notion which is very pervasive in a lot of the scholarship. That either that there is something in the faith that licenses it, that with the spread of Islam goes the spread of slavery. And you're actually telling a story which is really different, which is about tensions between clerics and people others who are Muslim, sort of saying this is, there's a sort of a disagreement that's taking place. And so I wonder, so there's your local story, but I also get the sense that you're telling a much bigger story about how we think about Islam, how we think about slavery, and what their relationship is to each other.
Yeah. So the way that I would start to answer this question is the piece that Sylviane mentioned in the introduction from the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Slavery in Islamic Africa, 1400 to 1800. So this is an attempt to do a synthetic overview of the history of slavery in all African Muslim societies, while at the same time looking at doctrinal debates within Islamic thought about enslavement. And the way that I'll just, so the short answer is that we were told a lie by late 19th and early 20th century Orientalists who suggested that slavery and Islam were coterminous. And this was part of a very motivated attempt both to denigrate African societies and Muslim societies and to monopolize claims on freedom and emancipatory thought within a Western post-Enlightenment tradition. So that Islam and African societies become coterminous with slavery and despotism, and the white people are to be given credit for everything that was ever liberatory or emancipatory in human thought. And so the way in which we approached the question of the relationship between slavery and Islam was not historical. It was polemical. And people referred to particular canonical texts, not the Quran itself, almost never the Quran itself, but to later legal texts to paint a portrait of an Islamic law that was accepting of slavery. Whereas once you start to scratch the surface of the actual legal opinions, you realize that nobody agreed about anything. And there were people that never accepted the idea that any enslavement could happen beyond the time of the original wars that the Prophet himself directed, and that he himself had freed any person that he had ever owned during his life before he died, and that there was a very powerful thread of anti-slavery thought within Islam that was being systematically downplayed. And so part of what I was doing both in the Cambridge World History of Slavery piece, and I also wrote, there's a new one coming out on the 19th century as well that picks up where that story left off. So what I was doing in both of those chapters, as well as in this one, is trying to tell a historical story that gave expression to some of that intellectual ambivalence about slavery within Muslim societies, and to see that people actually found resources to think against slavery within conventional Islamic thought.
50 years ago, in 1966, David Bryan Davis won a Pulitzer Prize for the problem of slavery in Western culture. And it sounds like we need a problem of slavery in Islamic culture. Because part of what he was doing there was talking about the tensions, the debates, the doctrinal disputes, to show the way that, throughout the history of the Western tradition, right, there was all of this wrestling over slavery. And it sounds like what we need to think about is some of these doctrinal disputes, not to see Islam as a monolith, but instead as a kind of a running series of debates and conversations about not only whether slavery good or bad, but all of the different ways to think about it, to think about what it means symbolically, what it means in terms of kinship, what it means in terms of the polity, what it means in terms of gender relations. I mean, there's a lot of complexity there, right?
I couldn't agree more, and it's funny that you say that because David Eltis has recommended that I write just such a book, and I don't know whether I'm going to do that or not, because I'm working on a book actually that comes out of this chapter called The First Atlantic Revolution, which is really about the story that we'll tell tonight. But I mean, I think that there's no doubt that book needs to be written. I'll throw in a quick vignette just to kind of capture, some of the tenor of the early Muslim thought. This is also cited in the chapter, but Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was one of the first four caliphs in Islam, he's the second of them. During the time of the Arab conquest, so that there are captives that are being taken, and slavery is legal in all of the areas that are subject to the early Arab conquest. So there isn't necessarily a particular debate about abolition as such, but the idea that a person who becomes Muslim could still be kept as a slave was something that was abhorrent. So oftentimes they said that he would see people amongst the captives, the enemy combatants, and he would find them praying, and if he found them praying, he would immediately set them free. And they said, Commander of the Faithful, don't you know that they're just deceiving you to get their freedom? And he said, better to be deceived by the one who deceives us in favor of God than to keep in bondage one who prays to him.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think maybe we should talk about the First Atlantic Revolution. Give us a little bit of preview of this second book.
Yeah.
And it really is, so I will confess that in reading the Walking Quran, I was stunned by the first chapter and the way that you set it up. It's not a subject that I know a great deal about, but I found it very compelling, deeply humane. More than most academic scholarship. I think it's a book that can be read profitably by anyone who wants to know something about the Quran and education and knowledge and West Africa. But I admit I've sort of really concentrated on the third chapter because this is something that I thought I knew something about. But I also knew that you knew things about it that I did not know and probably could not know.
And vice versa, because I'm not about to read a bunch of 18th century British history.
So I went immediately to this, and when you've been reading about a subject for a little while, you start to feel like you can't really be surprised by much, or you can be surprised at a small level, but you can't have the whole subject turned upside down.
This turns it upside down and shakes it.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I mean, it's about a revolution, but it's also kind of revolutionary as an interpretation. So I'm not quite sure where to start. I mean, I guess the place I'd like to start is one of the gauntlets that you throw down is to describe what is a religious movement, that is also a political movement, that is also a social movement, as also an abolitionist movement.
Yes.
Now, if you read the scholarship, much of the scholarship that I know very well, and scholarship that I've tried to contribute to, there were no abolitionists in Africa.
That's what they say.
Okay, but this is actually a story not about an abolitionist, but abolitionism, like an entire movement itself. So, explain.
Yeah.
How's that possible? It's not supposed to be there.
And yet and still, it happened. I mean, what the question calls to mind is Michel Rolfe Trio's wonderful monograph, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. Yeah. Because he also talks about a forgotten and silenced revolution. In his case, he's writing about the Haitian Revolution, and he talks about how the Haitian Revolution was unthinkable even as it happened. Yeah. Like, it was happening, but people still didn't want to believe it, because the idea that a bunch of illiterate Africans would defeat militarily the most powerful empire of the time, and that they would establish the first
also the most valuable colony in the Americas.
Don't forget that part, because after that, the Napoleon's like, okay, well, that's it for the New World, and we get the Louisiana Purchase because those illiterate Congolese slaves largely would not stop fighting, even when the Creoles did. So his argument, in that book, is that the thing was unthinkable even as it happened, precisely because we couldn't imagine Africans, acting in this particular way. Now, this revolution functions to a certain extent, in similar fashion. It's a complete overturn of the social and political system in the Senegal River Valley, and really throughout Senegambia, because it acts as a magnet drawing people from surrounding countries into it. And it happens basically in this way, and then I'll just try to do a short version of this. The reason why this chapter is in this book, which is called The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and History in West Africa, that the argument of the book as a whole is that traditional Quran schooling, like you find in West Africa, is designed to not just teach somebody something that they'll understand in their mind, but rather to anchor the Quran as word in living human flesh. So that the people become, as the Prophet is described in a hadith, like the Quran walking upon the earth. That's where the title comes from. So what happens after that mass enslavement in the 1670s, I started to ask myself the question, well, if these people, if the clerics, the scholars, who all have to memorize the entirety of the Quran before they can become Quran teachers, if they're seen as living copies of the book, what's going to be the response in Senegambian society to having these people captured, taken away in chains, and sold as slaves? If somebody trying to flush a paper copy of the Quran down a toilet in Abu Ghraib makes people upset in the Muslim world today, what's going to be the response in Senegambian society to have hundreds or thousands of human copies of the Quran taken away in chains? If that lunatic Terry Jones tries to burn as many copies of the Quran as he can find and the Muslims are in an uproar, what's going to be the response in Senegambian society? So I began looking systematically, and I knew of a couple of stories where the enslavement of a Quran reciter led directly to some kind of resistance. And I began to find dozens of these. In the end, I ended up with more than 75 individual incidences where the enslavement of a Quran reciter or the children of a Quran reciter or the spouse of a Quran reciter led directly to a revolt, a rebellion, or in this case, a revolution. Because this revolution in the Senegal River Valley was framed by a series of conspicuous incidences of enslavement of prominent clerics that increasingly radicalized the society. And this abomination of seeing people who embody God's holy word, his verbatim speech in Islamic thought, that's the thing that galvanizes the society and allows them to express a kind of general discontent towards the society that has come into being during the Atlantic slave trade. So they turn it upside down. And clerics traditionally in this region were people who never held political power. They were generally forbidden to bear arms. And they did so anyway. They taught themselves to do it because they said, if these are the kings that we got, then no more kings. They not only tried to abolish first the slave trade, then the institution of slavery itself, but they also abolished monarchy and introduce a kind of form of clerical republicanism. And that's where the first Atlantic Revolution idea comes in, is that this is not just a revolution that is about defining the bounds of liberty, in the same way that the American Revolution or the Haitian Revolution or the French Revolution is trying to define what liberty is, even if we end up selling out pretty hard on the whole slavery thing in this particular country. But it's also one that is seeking to put an end to monarchy. It's also an Atlantic Revolution, and this is stuff that's not in the book. This is stuff that I'm working on in a monograph specifically focused on the revolution, not talking about it within a context of an argument about embodiment, but telling the story in its own terms, is that this, I can track some of the enslaved lieutenants of this military movement when they lose important battles, and I can trace them to a slave rebellion in Antigua. I can trace them to Savannah and to Charleston in the 1770s and then again in the 1790s. This is an Atlantic Revolution because some of its agents and lieutenants get exported as slaves, and they end up spreading word of this revolution in slave barracks in exactly the kinds of ways that Sylviane Diouf, elucidated in her lovely book, which my students are reading, actually in both my classes. They're reading it in my Islam and Africa class, and they're reading it in my pre-colonial African history class in the same week, which works well for me, because then it's just one thing for me to read. Sorry.
I got to stop you right there.
Please stop.
How do you know that? How do you know that there are lieutenants who end up in these particular, because one of the, it's a real challenge to track individuals from captivity in West Africa.
Never really been done.
And the fact of the matter is that, we have, a dozen, 2 dozen very well-known figures that we, in our classes talk about, that these are the people. But you've got new You got new stories to tell.
I do. So, but it's also like it depends on how you understand diaspora history and how you formulate it, right? So most of the people that write, even the very best monographs on African cultural contributions to New World societies, they formulate a bunch of questions based on how a New World society works, and then they go back in a piecemeal fashion to African societies and look for antecedents or precedents to that. I'm starting and moving in the direction that the history actually happened, which is that I'm starting with a lived historical experience that I can document and detail vividly. Right. I mean, I know when battles are fought. I know what the debates are, what's being discussed, and I know who the people are. And then I'm following them as they move into the Atlantic world, which is different than having your research questions driven by diaspora dynamics and then trying to figure out where they might have come from. I'm saying that African history doesn't stop being African history just because Africans get shipped out of the continent.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Can I get an amen from the congregation? But in this specific case, I'll give you a specific example. So in the chapter, you have Mungo Park, who is providing he's in Senegambia in 1796 when the major, this is the major defeat that's suffered by the clerical party happens at this point in time. It's their leader, the Imam Abdul Qadir Khan, is taken prisoner. He's eventually released by the Damal of Kajor, pictured here, who's the most powerful of the slave trading kings in this period. So Mungo Park leaves a detailed account of all of the interactions between Abdul Qadir Khan and the Damal of Kajor. One of them is really nice. The Abdul Qadir Khan sends emissaries before they get into battle. He sends two of his Quran reciters, each carrying a long pole with a huge knife affixed to the top of the pole.
It's a great story.
Isn't it a great story?
Yeah.
So he says they go to the Damel, who is the biggest slaver in the region. Also, these are not just slave traders, but they're also hard drinkers. Like they're known for this. They don't hide this. They drink publicly, which is kind of flouting Islamic law, in public terms. So the first man says, with this knife, the Imam Abdul Qadir will deign to shave your head, which is the symbol of conversion to Islam. It's also the thing that marks, the ritual state, entering into the ritual state that you need to go on pilgrimage. It's a rebirth. Okay, so with this knife, he'll shave your head if you will stop selling the Muslims and give up alcoholic drinks. And then the other one says, and with this knife, if you don't, he'll gladly cut your throat. So them's fighting words, So what the two parties end up clashing, and for the first time in 10 years, Abdul Qadir Khan, the leader of this revolutionary movement, he loses a major battle, and he's taken prisoner. And Mungo Park hears the story about how he's actually pardoned, and he doesn't quite believe it until he's on a ship that's supposed to take him to Charleston. This is a Scottish explorer going to Charleston. He said there's 120 slaves on the ship. He leaves an account, a detailed account. He says 120 slaves on the ship. Wow. 25 of them were literate clerics, and I conversed with them in Arabic.
Wow.
He said 9 of them were lieutenants of Al-Mami Abdul Qadir Khan. Al-Mami was the title in Pular. That's how you say Al-Imam, El-Imam, the leader in Pular. He was with them in the battle that they lost at Bungoy. He was with them by the tree when they lost, and they told the story of what happened there to him that day to me in Arabic, confirming what I had heard from the griots when I was there in 1796. Now,
it's unbelievable.
Yeah, but it gets better. It gets better. So, and this isn't in the book. Yeah. It's not in the Walking Quran. It's in the book that I'm working on now. So, the boat springs a leak. And so they have to bring the slaves up above board to have them bailing water out of the boat, and it's not going to make it to Charleston. So they have to go to Antigua instead, because it's the closest point that they can go aboard, and the ship has been totaled. So, well, in other words, it's a loss. It can't be saved. They have to liquidate the cargo, which is the people. And so they have to sell them all on the spot. And so I'm learning about this before I go to do some research at the British Public Records Office, and hopefully we'll also talk about how the British sources end up really, shedding new light on this particular story. But using David Eltis's wonderful slavevoyages.org, this Atlantic slave trade database, which if you haven't used it, use it.
It's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. It shows. Please say a word or two about it.
Just very quickly, a team of historians over the course of probably 30 or 40 years have collected information on what they every known slave voyage that they've been able to record. 35,000 are in this database, going from the mid-16th century down to the late 19th century. And there's all kinds of information that's not in it, but what is in it is fascinating, because you can manipulate the information in any number of ways. By the nation from the European nation that was involved, the owner of the ship, the names of the captains, the number of sailors, the individual ports at which a ship went on, where they traded, how many embarked, how many disembarked on the other end in the Americas, which is almost never the same number. I mean, I could go on and on about them. It's sort of the ways that you can manipulate this and find all kinds of useful. And actually, I have a question that comes out of that.
To make it concrete, one of the things that you can do with it is that you can research all of the voyages that come from Senegal and Gambia only, that come from San Luis, Gorée, and Fort James, and which ones go straight from there to Savannah and to Charleston, for example, which is part of what.
So did you find the boat?
Not only did I find the boat. So one of the things that you learn from the database is that there aren't any imports into Antigua from predominantly Muslim areas for a span of about 20 years before this particular boat arrives. So I'm thinking, man, these brothers are going to stick out like a sore thumb in Antigua. And I don't have time to, and also I don't know anything about plantation records in the New World. I am not a historian of the New World. I'm an Africanist. Nah. We're getting there. So I said, well, let me see what I can find while I'm here in London. I said, well, maybe there's newspapers. And there was a colonial newspaper that started in 1786 for Antigua. And 6 months after this boat arrives, there's a slave rebellion. And the paper talks about it. And then I kid you not, what it actually says in the newspaper, that the slave rebellion was fomented by a mysterious slave known by the name Gorée. The point of embarkment associated, slaves were often called by the place in Africa from whence they were sent. Now, so do I have a smoking gun?
I was about to say it's a smoking gun.
It's about as close as you're going to get. And then in South Carolina and Savannah, when you know what Fulani names and what Wolof names look like, when slaves run away. And Michael Gomez in his book Exchanging Our Country Marks uses slave runaway notices to good effect, because when slaves run away, masters they don't insist on having a slave called Toby in a runaway ad, because they're trying to get the slave back. So they say he prefers to be called Kunta. Right? So this is a hypothetical example, but it's literally true that they'll often print African names alongside, the European names. And if you know something about naming conventions in a place, it's not that hard to track people down. One of the people that we found, my wife and I were doing research, her for a novel and myself for a book, was a woman called Kumba. She ends up taking the name Kumba Eric, and she is the first free black on the Georgia census in 1786. She's almost certainly Senegambian. She's certainly Senegambian, likely Wolof or Fula, but she's the first free black. She has a son that's listed also on that census. It's hard to say who the father is on the first one, but on the second census, it becomes clear that it's a white man that lives. He's listed as a next-door neighbor in the previous census. That young man goes on to serve in the Georgia State Militia.
It's incredible.
So there are ways that you can track some of these people across space and time, but only if you know in specific terms what pieces of African history you're trying to follow through on. And that's why, to a certain extent, it takes an Africanist to do that part of it.
Yes, and it should be said, there are very few historians of West Africa who've made this move into following the diaspora into the Americas. I mean, really, it's an interesting thing professionally that many
Well, it's-
Africanists. I mean, it's not that surprising. That's what you're trained to do. It's what you're interested in. But,
No, but there's
there are
something more-
there are
there's
missed
some-
opportunities, and there's something else going on.
There's something more insidious behind it, which is that there has been for a long time an informal effort well, it wasn't even informal, right?
Yeah.
Philip Curtin in his, 1994 presidential address to the African Studies Association, he titles his talk "The Ghettoization of African History." And he warned against the idea that too many Africans and African Americans would become practicing historians of Africa, and that this would reduce the quality of scholarship in the field and also lead to its being marginalized within the academia. This was so that's part of what's behind an inattention oftentimes to telling diaspora stories as part of African history amongst some Africanists, certainly not amongst all, but amongst some.
And it has been changing in our professional lifetime too. I mean, I feel like there are more and more people who have been trained in different parts of West Africa who are doing this kind of work.
Or who've trained themselves in West African history. James Sweet at the University of Wisconsin trained as a Latin Americanist, but trained himself as an Africanist and wrote 2 extraordinary books, Recreating Africa, one, and then The Story of Domingos Alvarez, another, which is the story of a specific enslaved person from Dahomey, and he follows his whole life story through several different, New World places. So it can be done, and I'm trying to do it.
So this conversation actually leads me to ask a question that I hadn't been thinking about until we talked. And it's to think about Senegambia and the Atlantic slave trade in a slightly larger context. You invoked Philip Curtin, who's a very controversial sort of standing in this, in the historical literature. In some ways, he's the founder of that database. That we were talking about, that we were praising, which has been so important for all kinds of research, since it was really his question, how many people, move from one place to the other, and where they come from and where they go, that got a lot of this research started. But one of the things I think it's interesting is that when you look at Senegal and Gambia together, this region together, in the span of the entire West African coast, down to present day Ghana and Benin, Nigeria, the Cameroons, down to Angola, Congo. It's never a very large portion of the Atlantic slave trade as far as the information that we have available to us today. And one of the things I want to ask you is whether, and it's one of the things I've always found difficult to explain to undergraduates. It's the closest place to Europe.
It's the earliest
and it's
place.
the shortest voyage to the Americas. So from a strictly convenient standpoint, that's where the slave trade should be centered. What do you think of this? That one explanation for the relative proportional, now we're talking about tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of people who are shipped from this region, so it's not like it's marginal, peripheral, but compared to the whole thing, it's not the largest part of it. To what extent is it the influence of Islam in this region that actually explains the comparatively lower numbers? Because I've never seen anybody make that argument in that sort of as explicit a fashion, but I feel like that's implicit in some of what you're saying.
It is, and I have seen one person make the argument in print, and it was Paul Lovejoy in a piece, I'm forgetting the title, but it's in the Revue d'Histoire d'Outre-mer in 2002, and he says Islam as a factor of potential constraint on the Atlantic slave trade. And so he actually makes explicitly that argument, and he extends it to also take into account northern Nigeria, the northern parts of basically all of the Islamic regions, and says, look, statistically, this should have been a much more significant contributor to the Atlantic slave trade. I think that we have to consider the idea that Islamic resistance
as a cultural restraint.
Exactly. Yeah. But I will take issue with one thing, which is that it would be correct to say that it was never the main region of slave supply if we dismiss the 16th century, because for the 16th century it's supplying the bulk of the slave trade. And I learned from Sylviane Diouf's book, a number of years ago, that there was a historian in the 1980s going through the Spanish sources that said that something like 60% of the enslaved people brought into New Spain, what becomes Mexico, between 1525 and 1575, roughly in that period. Don't quote me on the dates, but to something like 60% of that total slave population could be identified as Wolof or Fula. Yeah. So that you had actually not... Muslims oftentimes are a plurality. They're the largest group in a diverse group of enslaved people. But in the 16th century, it was frequently the case that they were actually a majority. Yep. And that the impact of the Atlantic slave trade on Senegambian society in the 16th century has been largely underexplored, in part because the Atlantic slave trade database is weak on the 16th century.
It's also weak on Spanish sources, and it's weak on Portuguese sources.
Yep. So the numbers that they have, in my opinion, are likely to grow by as much as 20 to 30%. Because if you look at it from the side of the Spanish sources, and I was blessed to teach a class with Sherwin Bryant, a historian of the Andes, when I was teaching at Northwestern, and he was saying, look, I got Jalofo slaves all over my Spanish sources everywhere I turn. Somebody should write a history of a political history of Senegal in the 16th century just off of what you can find in the Spanish sources. But of course, that has never happened,
right.
Because people have tended to restrict themselves to French colonial sources, yeah. Which actually brings us around to what's so specific about this story and what's bringing us together on this one, right? Is because part of the story that you're telling is in the book that you're writing is about the British colony of Senegambia, which people forget that it even existed, but because they think of Senegal as a French colony. But what drew me to these sources in the British Public Records Office was that I realized that during the time of this revolution in the 1760s and 1770s into the 1780s, Senegal was not a French colony at all. Yeah. And that the British archives were the place that I was likely to find archival materials that were on the revolution.
And that's the fact of the matter is that the amount of material that's there is very abundant.
It's staggering.
And almost entirely untapped.
Yes.
So we're going to open this up to questions in just a minute, but I'll just say that the piece of this that brings me to this subject is what is in fact the first British effort to colonize West Africa in the 18th century. Some of you will know about Sierra Leone and the founding of Sierra Leone. Refugees from North American slavery who leave with the British and settle on the West African coast. Well, 2 decades before that was actually the first British colony in West Africa. When I learned about this the first time, I had been working on the history of British slavery and anti-slavery in the Atlantic slave trade for about a dozen years. I'd never heard of the province of Senegambia. It's an extraordinary instance in which an entire colonial project can
vanish.
Can literally vanish. It's as if it never happened. A 25-year period in which the English occupied the base of the Senegal River, ran it like it was a colony, like it was South Carolina, in terms of the way they had tried to administer it. They didn't settle it with families. They settled it with garrisons, with soldiers, and with sailors, and with traders. There were only English men. There were no English women and children there. But from the standpoint of the British government, this was a province of the crown. And even more than that, what they wanted to do, ideally, was turn the Senegal River into the Chesapeake.
They absolutely did.
They imagined cotton plantations, indigo plantations. They imagined turning this part of West Africa into a New Britain, effectively. Now, there's a lot to say about it, but it was a failure from beginning. Then we were laughing about this before we came in, because it's one of the reasons why no one knows this history is this an embarrassment from beginning to end for the British. And remarkably, even in the immediate aftermath of it, when this thing fails in the mid-1770s, 1780s, in part because of the Atlantic Revolution that you're writing about.
And I'll say
so the British are facing revolutions in North America and in West Africa the exact same period of time, and losing in both of them. They immediately afterwards, it's as if it never happened. The British spent the next 25 years debating the future of their slave trade and the future of their West African commerce, about trying to get Sierra Leone off the ground. There is no reference anywhere in British sources, and I've read a lot of them, to the province of Senegambia. So it literally disappears. It's not only that we don't remember it today in the 21st century, several years afterwards, this attempt to build a colony, build a province, there is, largely forgotten. So it's another one of these sort of, it's kind of unthinkable in a different sense. That the British are supposed to be competent, powerful, exert military authority, and they all die in droves and leave in embarrassment.
Well, and they're at each other's throats. I mean, they're literally killing one another. There's one mutiny after another in this colony. But it's good that we brought it back to the British sources in the end, because the one place where there is a trace left, and this is one of the most, I think it was one of the most significant sources that led to this particular chapter, is the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, who is essentially the founder of the modern British abolitionist movement, and he's also the unacknowledged founder of La Société des Amis des Noirs, the first modern French abolitionist movement as well. He's the founder of both of these, in point of fact. He writes extensively. The first book that he publishes, he spends about 15 to 20% of the total page count in the book talking about this revolution. And he knows Al-Mami Abdul Qadir Khan's name. And he gives him the last word in his text. And he says, this wise and virtuous Al-Mami is a model for the sovereigns of Europe, because he's done what they don't have the courage to do. And he's made more of a contribution to the causes of liberty, justice, humanity, and religion than they have. And this is coming from a British Protestant abolitionist praising an African Muslim ruler for doing what the rulers of Europe have not yet had the courage to do. And that's the other sort of Atlantic dimension of the story that I'm trying to tell in its fullness, is that this story that abolitionism emerges fully formed like Athena from the waves, carrying some version of Greek Enlightenment with it, is bogus, because when Thomas Clarkson is trying to push the British to abolish the slave trade, he's lauding an African Muslim ruler who has already abolished it. So the chronologies and the cause and effect stories that we have about how abolitionism comes from enlightened white people and is then spread to other less white people doesn't hold up even in the life of the founder of the modern abolitionist movement itself, because he's singing the praises of Abdul Qadir Khan. And he knows details of the revolution because he's interviewing all of those slave ship captains that have been operating the British trade, and he interviews all the slave ship captains that have been operating the French trade. So he gets detailed reconnaissance. He's giving you dates and places and names, and he's telling you that first he created an embargo. He wouldn't let the slave traders cross his territory. Then he gave, and this is how he effected his abolition, he would give freedom to any person who would recite a single verse of the Quran. Not a chapter of the Quran, a single verse of the Quran. For Abdul Qadir Khan, not even the tiniest fraction of God's verbatim speech should ever be held as a slave. And it was said that, when sometimes I hear from the students, yeah, but Professor Ware, he's saying you still have to become Muslim in order to get free. And that is true, but everyone in the area is Muslim to begin with, even the enslaved people. And he also doesn't, in the oral tradition, what he's credited with saying, he said the Muslim that should be protected from enslavement is the one that says, La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God, even if he pronounces it, Ra iraha irra. In other words, fake your way through it, and I'll put you under my protection. The idea is that he's going to try to use Muslim identity, which provides legal protections to Muslims against enslavement. He's going to try to use it to protect any African that he can from enslavement.
All of this is in the third chapter.
Yes.
Titled "The Book in Chains." It's a truly brilliant turn. I think we should obviously we could talk for a while.
Several days.
Several days, exactly. So, but I think we should open it up a little bit and give people a few minutes to ask some questions. So, in front.
This is so interesting and very fascinating. I don't know a ton
Yeah.
How much different was it from the slaves that were being kept?
They knew a lot about it. The people that were putting people in the boats sometimes ended up in boats themselves.
Repeat the question just so that everybody can hear.
What did people that were involved in trading slaves know about what their ultimate, destiny would be, and were there dramatic differences between the kinds of plantation slavery that people experienced in the New World and what was existing at the coast? Is that a fair representation of your question? So the answer to the first part of the question is people can't pretend like that the Africans that were involved didn't know what was going on. They did, and in fact, it sometimes happened that their own lieutenants would be taken as slaves. Sometimes when they owed debts to European slavers, they would themselves get liquidated and end up as slaves. And this comes across a number of times in the Portuguese, sources, and stories like that, circulate. Sometimes people even made it back. After these kinds of experiences, and there's a prominent story of one of these people in the chapter that you have here. So people know when you get away from the coast, people don't have a lot of detailed information. One of the things is that pretty much all children believe that white people eat people, and that's what happens to the people that get sent into the Atlantic slave trade. The white people chew them up and spit them out, which is not really that far from the truth. There's another story that's frequently told in West Central Africa about that the slaves go to the coast and there's a human sacrifice that's done. They're killed there and they get thrown into the water, and the sacrificed body of a slave is the only thing on which cowrie shells will grow. Now, cowrie shells are used as currency in this region. So this too is true. Even if it's not necessarily biologically possible, it's nonetheless true. So people know that this is death, practically speaking. But there are always, in these societies, when the demand is that great for enslaved persons coming from the New World, there's always somebody that's going to be willing to trade under those circumstances. And you already saw in what I described from the 1670s about how when groups come to power that are opposed to the Atlantic slave trade, the Europeans, while they might not be able to go in and force the slave trade, they're perfectly capable of arming and providing logistical support and providing gunboats and soldiers to parties who are interested in continuing the trade. And that's what they do. Clarkson refers to this in his letters on the slave trade. He said the policy of Europeans in Africa is to subvert the just principles of government and turn kings into wolves instead of shepherds amongst their people. And so if you want to just think about it in a word, the European policy in Africa is feed the wolves, starve the shepherds.
Right here.
When and how was Islam brought to this area?
Islam comes to the Senegal River Valley by the end of the 9th century CE. One of the things that distinguishes sub-Saharan Africa as a region, as a whole in the Muslim world, is that sub-Saharan Africa is not subject to the military conquest that characterized the initial spread of Islam from the Arab heartlands to the foam of the sea, as it is in conventional Muslim accounts, and basically Western Morocco, Western Sahara, and also into Spain. Because they're actually defeated when they try to come down the Nile in 652 CE. A Christian Nubian kingdom sends them back. The accounts say that the Nubian archers can put an arrow in your eye from 300 paces, so we signed a truce. Basically, good reason. Also, it was difficult to move soldiers across the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert. And there were large, powerful empires on the other side already in the 600s. The Ghana Empire was just to the south of the desert, and an 11th century source said that the Emperor of Ghana can put 200,000 soldiers in the field, 40,000 of them archers. So you were not about to conquer the empire of Ghana under any circumstances. So what happens instead is that it's first merchant connections that bring Islam to West Africa. But ultimately, it's the formation of an indigenous clerical class that causes Islam to spread within sub-Saharan African society. And that's what I talk about in the second chapter of the book. And you can actually trace back to two towns in the Empire of Ghana, a town called Jaga and a town called Kabara, where the ancestors of some of the oldest clerical lineages, teaching lineages in West Africa, first began to specialize in the teaching of the Quran. And people, to this day, there were four families: Sise, Drame, Ture, Jane. These are the first four groups of people to start to specialize in teaching the Quran, and it's through the jihad of those wooden slate boards that they learn the Quran on. It's the jihad of the wooden board, not the jihad of the sword, that spreads Islam through West Africa. So that by about 1400, all of this region here is almost entirely Muslim, and it's likewise the case pretty much in a continuous strip from Senegal on the west coast to Somalia on the other. That if you run across the northern parts of those countries, they all become Muslim. Something like 1,000 years ago, Islam becomes an important factor. It becomes a majority religion by 12 or 1300. It becomes the exclusive religion by about 1500, and all of those places are between 90 and 98% Muslim today, without any external conquest bringing Islam to the area.
Great. In the back?
Yes, I had a question about Senegambia, the role to African Americans. You hear a lot about the connection in that region. I was just wondering if you could kind of explain the history, context of the contribution to.
Yeah, I mean, it's significant. We could be here all night discussing the answer to that particular question, but I'm going to answer it this way. There's never a place in the history of slavery in North America where enslaved Muslims from the Senegambia region are a majority in any particular place in time. But there's a number of places where they're a plurality at specific foundational moments. They're the largest group amongst the enslaved population in the Sea Islands of Georgia in the 1770s to the 1790s. And this leaves a huge imprint on African American culture in those coastal regions. They're a plurality in Louisiana in certain portions of the trade as well. And what happens is that they're not able to necessarily reproduce Muslim institutions, although there are functioning Quran schools in slave barracks in different parts of the New World at different points in time. One of the main problems with being a slave is that you don't have control over your children. Your children can be sold away from you, and then you do not have the ability to educate them the way that you otherwise might. So reproducing Islam, from one generation to the next becomes complicated. It does happen, but it's hard. But there are deep cultural effects that come from having Islam be the predominant matrix for identity in a particular place in a particular time that's foundational. And I'll just give you one example that my wife came across when she was doing research for her work, Fire and Clay. And her work, in a certain sense, is the mirror of the Walking Quran. It's a story it's a novel that's about a marriage between a Muslim cleric in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s, and a Muslim female jinn, a genie, a bodiless spirit that can take human form. And the jinn figure prominently in the story that I'm about to tell. So I was teaching a class, African popular culture, and we were talking about quote-unquote African superstitions. And one of the African American students in the class said to me, well, if you ever swept over my grandmother's foot with a broom, she would fly into a rage. How many people know this one? Okay, so I asked him what I'm about to ask you. What do you do if somebody sweeps over your foot with a broom? You spit on the broom. And what's the other thing you can do if you don't spit on the broom? Throw salt over your left shoulder. You just did over the right shoulder, but my grandfather always threw it over his left shoulder. And if you ever got anywhere near his foot with a broom, he would jump back. And to this day, I jump back if you get anywhere near my feet with a broom. Get away. What's wrong with you? So we're mentioning this in class, and there's a Pakistani girl sitting in the corner of the class who hasn't been paying any attention to anything anybody said until we get to this point, and she said, wait a minute, what are you supposed to do if somebody sweeps over your foot with a broom? And we say, spit on it. She said, that's exactly what we do in Pakistan. And so I come home and I tell my wife this story, and she says, oh, I understand this. She said, I was doing research for my book about the jinn. Okay, and she was systematically collecting folk tales about jinn from one part of the Muslim world to the next. And jinn are often associated with brooms. They're associated with brooms in West Africa in particular because they're the things that are used to sweep outhouses and kitchens, both of which are outdoor spaces where impure material is found, blood and waste. And especially maleficent jinn are attracted to those kinds of areas. Okay? So the classical Islamic theologians said that you protected yourself by pronouncing words of protection from the Quran. Usually the last two surahs of the Quran that are known as the two protectors, you say them and you spit the saliva. Or you throw salt because jinn that incite people to evil follow them on their left shoulder. Whereas jinn are just like people. They can be good or bad. And the good ones will tend to follow you on your good hand, on the good foot, as James would say. So throw salt over the left shoulder to drive them off. So now, so what's going on? People saw this, one generation after the next, repeated it. African Americans still know, down to this day, that if somebody sweeps over your foot with a broom, you have to spit on it, but we don't know the words of the prayer anymore. So that at deep levels in African American culture, there's an Islamic imprint, even when we're not necessarily aware that it's an Islamic imprint at all.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in the interest of expanding this, thank you for your scholarship. In the interest of expanding it, I was wanting to talk about the people south of the Gambia River. You know, the Joel who were non-Muslim, Joel
Sure.
and who also left a large imprint.
Absolutely.
On the American genome.
Absolutely.
And had a really specific.
Yes.
Not Futatoro, but you know, a
In-
little bit further south.
Well, in Futa Jalon with the Fulbe population there.
Were really tied into the trade as well. but
Sure.
they often were not Muslim. but
Right.
Trying to be traditional.
Yeah, and one of my favorite books, and I assigned this in my pre-colonial Africa survey, is a book by Robert Baum called Shrines of the Slave Trade. And it's about Jola religion. And in a lot of ways it's about Jola religion, especially during the period of the slave trade. And it tells a story that's in a lot of ways similar to parts of the story that I tell in this book. It talks about how initially in Jola shrines, there are no shrines that are associated with slavery. Slavery probably doesn't even exist as a social institution. But as all of a sudden, this form of wealth becomes common with the rise of the slave trade, suddenly shrines start popping up that are of slave fetters. And there's particular sacrifices that you have to do to expiate the sin of kidnapping someone from within your own community and selling them. So that ultimately the religion gets corrupted by this influence from the Atlantic slave trade. Now the difference is, and I think that this is significant, is that corruption is clearly taking place with the hereditary kings. But Islam provides a legal language that Muslims should be protected from enslavement by one another, that allows a framework of identity larger than just any village or any region or any ethnic group. People that come from different ethnic backgrounds and different national origins decide that they have a common endeavor in protecting one another from enslavement. And that's extraordinarily rare anywhere else in Atlantic Africa, because every ethnic or political division has cash value. When there are Europeans that are willing to trade you valuable goods for the enslaved bodies of political rivals. So you don't see the kind of large imperial states that you saw in earlier eras in West Africa, because now every possible division is monetized.
Yep.
There are centripetal forces, the demand of the slave trade itself, that's pulling societies apart. Jola, Kikongo speakers, Kimbundu speakers, it doesn't matter. They're all subject to the same pressures. But part of the answer to your question from before, right, is that, well, maybe part of the reason why, this is going to sound really messed up, but why Islamic West Africa underperforms as a region of supply for the slave trade has to do with the fact that there's a matrix of identity which allows protection to be extended across national and ethnic borders. Now, it doesn't always work. These people end up fighting with and enslaving one another too. And the story in Futa Toro is a unique story. It's not a common story. It's more radical and revolutionary than anything anybody else does in that period. And that's why, I'm particularly drawn to that story.
I feel like we should probably let you go soon since we're 15 minutes past our time. I'm looking around for Gene Strauss to tell me if we can go on a little bit longer. What do you think?
I can take one or two more.
Take a couple more questions? Okay, up front. Wait for a while.
I got to visit Fort James and Kunta Kinte village.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that y'all have been there too.
I've not.
I've been to Banjul. I've never been to Jufure, the village, no. Okay. If it's a question that's specifically about the village, I can't answer it.
Probably talk to the same, when you go,
Right.
talk to the same people that I've talked to. And I just was wondering if you were convinced that was where Kunta Kinte came from. But I mean, since you didn't go there,
It's a little hard to know what people are saying exactly without having had the, experience. Yeah, right here.
We've heard a lot. Thank you as well. As you were talking, we heard a lot of names of men, male stories, and I'm curious what the story of women.
Yeah. It's a great question. So, the teacher of Islamic law for Abdul Qadir Khan, the founder of not the founder, he's the leader of this movement. The founder is a man who's actually killed in battle in 1776, but the leader that shepherds this movement from the 1770s into the 1800s. The teacher in Islamic law for Abdul Qadir Khan was a woman, and her name was Khadija bint Muhammad al-Aqil. She was Mauritanian, but all of both the Senegalese and Mauritanian scholars of her period all studied with her because she was reputed to be the most accomplished scholar, not only in all of the ordinary sciences, but also in all of the esoteric sciences of religion. Her own brothers, who had received authorizations to teach texts from their father, renewed their teaching licenses for those same texts with her, because you were thought of as deficient if you hadn't learned from her. And it was, if you read the second chapter of the book and also the fourth chapter of the book, you'll find a great deal of attention to the role of women in traditional Quran schooling and also in circuits of Islamic scholarship through West Africa. The short version of the story is that in the pre-colonial period, probably something like a third of the ordinary contingent within a Quran school are going to be girls. And that which is obviously much, much higher than a percentage than anywhere in Europe in a similar period. It sounds bad now, right, to say only 33%, but that's going to be 4 or 5 times higher than a similar percentage for most places in Europe at this particular point in time. And women, girls rather, they're thought of as having a deficient education in the following way. The ordinary way of giving somebody a rigorous Quranic education is you take them away to the home of a cleric and you leave them there until they memorize Quran. And you say, when you turn them over to the teacher, give me back a Quran or a corpse.
Wow.
That's also the walking Quran, right? I want that boy back as a book, or you can keep him. But this is not done with girls because girls don't spend the night outside of the home in West Africa. It's conservative in that way. So girls attend Quran schools as day students, and therefore they don't study for the same number of hours as boys, and because of that, their schooling was thought of as deficient. However, within clerical families, when you have the requisite teachers, not just for Quran, but for all of the religious sciences of Islam already within the family, then it was not only not uncommon, but it was actually ordinary to find extremely accomplished female scholars. They just always came from families that already had an established reputation for Islamic learning. it was unusual for girls from a non-clerical family to become religious scholars, whereas boys from non-clerical families sometimes would become religious scholars. That almost never happens in the case of girls. But within those clerical families, some of them become some of the most important intellectuals in West African history. Asma'u, the daughter of Usman Dan Fodio in northern Nigeria, several of Ahmadu Bamba, the founder of the Muridiyas, several of his daughters become important authors, not only in Arabic, but also writing the Wolof language with the Arabic script, which was also very common. And actually, practical literacy in Quran schools was usually taught to girls before it was taught to boys. Precisely because people thought that there were useful domestic applications of writing your mother tongue in the Arabic script. So what was often done is people would take the wooden tablets that they used to learn Quran, flip them over, and give voweling lessons so that you could write any language that you wanted to using Arabic letters. So girls are an important part of the story, even if they're not a big part of the political story. There is a nice monograph by my colleague at University of Michigan, Rebecca Scott. She wrote a book called Freedom Papers. And it's a multi-generational history that starts with an enslaved woman from Futa Toro who turns up in Saint-Domingue. There's just one cryptic entry about her, Rosalie de Nation Pulard, Rosalie of the Pular Nation. And she ends up being the progenitor of a number of, so she actually, Rebecca Scott follows this right down to the present day with descendants that are now white people living in Europe who played a particular role in anti-Nazi struggles and a bunch of other stories, and also black people living in Haiti. They were also involved in the political story, but unfortunately more often as enslaved people and pawns rather than prominent political actors.
All right, let's take one last question right here, please.
Do you find that there's a correlation between the failure of the public school system in certain areas and the lack of this information sort of information by students?
Man.
What was the question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. The question was, do I find that there is a correlation between a lack of information about this? Say it again, failure in the public school system was how it started.
The lack of this particular historical information for students,
Yeah.
so therefore
Yeah.
cause the failure of the motivation to seek this type of knowledge and so forth.
Yeah. So I'll paraphrase the question in responding to it. Yes, there's a catastrophic failure in the way that we teach this kind of information. I teach a pre-colonial African history survey at the University of Michigan, and before that at Northwestern University. And the first thing that I do is that the first day of class is I give the students note cards, and I say, don't write your name on the note card. And if it's a big class, I say, I want you to write down the first 3 things that you can think of when I say Africa to you. What are the first 3 things that come to your mind? And if it's a smaller class, I make it 5 things so that we've got more terms to work with. And then we write them out on the board and we map them in relationship to one another. And it's always safaris, hot, AIDS, poverty, Lion King, Tarzan, the usual stuff. And so I ask them, well, where are we getting, this information? It's like movies, if it was our generation, National Geographic. Well, how many of you had any African history in high school? Raise your hand. Like 2 hands. Okay, well, for the 2 of you that had your hands up, was that a week on the slave trade in your AP history class? Yes, it was. So that if you encounter African history at all, you encounter the slave trade. You don't encounter anything about African cultural history. You don't even know that there are Muslims in Africa. You would never know that 1 in 6 of the world's Muslims lives in sub-Saharan Africa. That there's more than 300 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa. That it's probably the only continent in the world that has a Muslim majority. You'll never learn that. So yeah, we're doing a terrible disservice, but it's particularly regrettable insofar as this story demonstrates that some of the genealogies of the values of liberty and emancipatory thought that we hold dear were articulated not just by the ancestors of the European population in this country, but by the ancestors of the African population as well. And that they were articulated in terms that were thought through with respect to the Quran rather than the Bible. They were thought through with respect to the Atlantic experience of being the victim of the slave trade rather than the Atlantic experience of being the progenitors of the slave trade. And I think that that story in particular would be a valuable corrective, and that's why I'm writing that book.
I think we should say thank you. That's great. Thanks again for coming, everyone, tonight. And we'll be out in the hallway signing books. Come up and say hello. We'll be happy to chat.
Thank you. That
Nice
was so
job,
much
man.
fun, man.
That was great.
Thank you.
It's just terrific. Hi.
If you go up the river, there's an island, I think it's George Island.